The setting of The Stranger is in the French colony of Algiers during the 1940s. Algiers, the capital of Algeria, rests along the Mediterranean Sea. The relative location of Algiers is important considering that much of the rising action and climax of The Stranger takes place at the beach. From the beginning of The Stranger, it is clear that the Arabs and the French perceive each other negatively. Both have fundamental, distinct qualities that separate them, and these perceptions lead to violence between the two groups. In The Stranger, this is evident when examining Ramon's abusive relationship with his ex-girlfriend, Ramon getting stabbed by the Arab on the beach, and Meursault shooting the Arab. The conflict between these two groups is rooted deeply in the French colonization of Algeria, which can be traced back to the start of the French Revolution. Colonization was not really considered at this time. Algeria was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans governed Algeria as a constitutional autocracy, but the Algerians had more control over their government rather than a traditional autocracy. Meanwhile, France was still in a period of political instability because of the revolution and the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 to 1815. Algiers, as it was called at the time in the French, actually had a good economic relationship before this. However, the revolution and the wars demanded a lot economically for the French, so they turned to Algiers to borrow money and grain. But by 1815, the French had accumulated 18 million francs in debt for Algiers wheat. The Dey of Algiers, a governor-type leader, requested payment for the debt and for the French consul to withdraw. The French refused, but instead asked for more money, which was compensation for acts that Algiers Navy did against the French Navy. In 1827, 8 years later, Dey Hussein met with the French consul and criticized their lack of communication about the payment for the debt. The consul's answers were unsatisfactory to Hussein, and he therefore struck the consul with a fly swatter. He didn't apologize or pay any reparations to France after this, either, which soured relations between the two groups. Right after this incident, the French started a 3-year siege of Algiers, which failed. They invaded in June 1830 with an army of 37,000. The King of France at the time, Charles X, hoped to win because he thought it would increase his chances of staying in power and clear their less than favorable domestic record. Besides that, they were fighting this war to retaliate for the fly swatter incident and also to end piracy in North Africa. Although there was resistance from Algerian troops, the French overthrew their government 4 weeks later and renamed Algiers Algeria. The original motives behind this military activity happened to fall short, since Charles was overthrown soon after. Plus, even though the government acknowledged that they had made some mistakes, they decided to continue the occupation for the sake of French prestige. So the French's policies on Algeria were indecisive and kept changing based on the different generals who were in charge. This is because they were focused mainly on domestic issues, not international ones. Basically, foreign relations were pushed to the side with France's government, while they were the biggest concern for the Algerian government. Ultimately, though, they decided to remain in Algeria because the number of French immigrants was increasing. Algeria was officially a French colony by 1934. Because the French were disregarding issues that were clearly important to Algerians, it's clear that the relations between the groups were going bad even further. This is evident through the Berber Muslims native to Algeria. They saw the French as a threat to their religion and independence and sided with Abd al-Qadir, a government official who was leading a guerrilla war. In 1837, he signed the Treaty of Tafna with France, which recognized that he had control over most of Algeria. Al-Qadir used treaties to gain more territory as a way to remain peaceful and to respect France's authority.
Even though relations weren't so great, they weren't completely ruined at this time. The Algerians still retained a lot of their previous rights, like the rights to practice their religion, own property, hold office, and have some independence. But by 1840, French policy started to favor total colonization and occupation. Such a policy was favorable to the French because they'd be able to compete with Britain, who was colonizing India. Just like before, motives included how they wanted to raise the country's standing and self-esteem after the economic damage of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. So there's a pretty drastic turning point here. The French decided that they had to eliminate al-Qadir and any support they had, and in order to do that, they decided to increase the suffering of the Algerians in pretty inhumane ways. First, the attitudes against Algerians turned intensely biased. The French started to view them as inferior and less human. This is seen throughout The Stranger, as all of the white French characters' attitudes towards the Arabs were negative. Meursault describes, "They were staring at us in silence, but in that way of theirs, as if we were nothing but stones or dead trees. Marie wanted to get going right away." Marie and Meursault were not comfortable near the Arabs and perceived them negatively upon noticing them. After this initial change in perspective, France's army started a scorched earth policy, where they would destroy all of the resources that could be useful to the Algerian army and Al-Qadir. On screen, you can see some of the different ways they did this, such as the slaughtering of livestock, burning harvests, destroying villages, cities, mosques, schools, homes, and means of commerce, killing all males over the age of 15, capturing women and children. Due to the scorched earth policy, the Arabs' population decreased exponentially. You will see that the majority of the characters seen in The Stranger are white, especially during the courtroom scenes. Additionally, when an Arab is described or noticed, it is always highlighted throughout the novel. For example, when Meursault talks to a group of Arabs, he says, "I said I'd killed an Arab, and they were all silent." Meursault characterizes the person as Arab rather than describing any other qualities, indicating that that ethnicity is primarily what separated the French and native Arabs. The French had pretty much killed a third of the population and caused physical and cultural genocide. By 1847, any support that Al-Qadir had was effectively eliminated. Thus, he surrendered so that he could end the suffering of the Algerians. After this, the French continued occupying more and more land in Algeria until it was officially recognized as a part of France in 1871. The Berbers were pushed out of the cities to the mountains to make room for about 100,000 French immigrants who were going to live in the cities. They faced food shortages, forced conversion to Christianity, and lost rights to be represented in government and to vote. Although they were eventually drawn back to the larger cities, their exclusion from society continued. As seen in The Stranger, Christianity is highly emphasized in society, but the Arabs' original religion of Islam is never acknowledged. The French took advantage of Algeria's natural resources, like iron ore, and used the Algerian land to produce cash crops like tobacco and vegetables. However, it is important to note that Algeria's resources were exploited and did not help Algeria to grow and become industrialized. Before the French colonized Algeria, it was not an industrialized nation, but it did have an abundance of resources. This shows that from the beginning, Algeria was seen only as a material object for the French, with only monetary value. Let's take another step back for a moment and review the motives for colonization and the war. Al-Qadir wished to restabilize Algeria, but the French wished to restore a decent international standing, end piracy in North Africa, and avenge the fly swatter incident. Looking back, we can observe that the French started to see the Arabs negatively because they wanted to further their own political agenda. And by losing their voice, culture, religion, and people to colonization, it's pretty easy to see why Arab Algerians saw the French negatively as well.